Hey guys, it's Rhea from Alewives Fabrics, and I thought it would be fun to give you a quick little video tutorial, very spur of the moment. It just occurred to me as I was making a sample for the shop. It might be fun to share with you guys the video for how to make the velveteen and voile throws that we do here at the store. So stay tuned, and I'm just going to go through step by step what we do. It's very quick, very easy, very hard to screw up. So stay tuned. So the first thing you're going to need to do is get yourself some velveteen and some voile. And at the shop we have just gotten in 2 velveteens from France, and this is one of them. It's actually 100% polyester, and I think sometimes polyester gets a bad rap, and you think of leisure suits in the 70s. This polyester is really, really lovely. It feels really, really nice. This is a 1.5 yard cut. This velveteen is 63 inches wide. So when you get a 1.5 yard cut, you're gonna have to trim it a little bit to make it a square. You want to trim it so that you have a 54-inch square piece, and you don't have to go nuts trimming it to try and get it to be super accurate. That's one of the nice things about this project is you don't have to be super accurate. It's a throw, it's not a quilt with seams and points that need to match up, so you don't have to worry if your square is perfectly 54 inches, but if you trim down and it's approximately 54 inches, this is one of those cases where close enough is good enough. So this is the velveteen that we're working with. We have another one upstairs, and we're actually kitting them up. So if you guys have velveteen from another source someplace else, that's great. You need a 54-inch square. Technically this might be a lawn, I can't remember, but this one is from Allison Glass, so this is going to be the reverse side of our throw. To me, voile and lawn are almost identical. I'm sure somebody out there can tell me what the difference is, but basically they're a cotton with a really high thread count, so they feel really, really silky. They feel thinner to the touch than a quilting weight cotton, but they actually have a really high thread count, so they're very, very strong and silky. And same thing, this we got a 1.5 yard cut. This is 54 inches. Actually, I think it's 57 inches off of the bolt. But we want to trim it so that we have approximately a 54-inch square. And with this one, I didn't have to do too much to it. All that I did was trim off the fuzzy parts of the selvage. So it's okay if you leave a little bit of the selvage on and you can see the words, because we're going to use a really large seam allowance. So those words and then the dotted parts of the selvage are going to get swallowed up by your seam allowance. The batting lined up underneath the velveteen, and I have it all lined up on one corner, on the bottom, and on the, what side is this? The left-hand side. And that's because I'm going to trim on the right-hand side and along the top where it's draped over the end of the table here. I could have just plopped the velveteen in the middle of the batting and then trimmed around all 4 sides, but I'm lazy. So I lined it up on the bottom corner and along the left, so they just have to trim on the right and along the top. That also gives me the biggest piece of batting scrap left over in case I want to use it for like a table runner or something like that, and then that means I only have to trim on 2 sides. That way my batting is going to be approximately the same size as my velveteen, and it's kind of a low-tech way of making sure that my velveteen, my batting, and my voile or lawn are all going to be the same size. And again, you don't have to get too technical with it. You don't have to get out your rotary cutter. You don't have to measure anything. This is one of those times when eyeballing everything is going to be good enough. Okay, next step. I have taken my square of voile and layered it on top of the square of velveteen and the square of batting. And the order of the layering is the voile and the velveteen should be right sides together with the batting underneath. And the type of batting that I'm using is the wool. It's Quilter's Dream. And I wanted to show you guys, see how the wool has those layers? almost like baklava is the way I describe it to people. I think a lot of times people hear, it's kind of like the poly, where the poly gets a bad rap because everybody thinks of the leisure suits in the 70s. I think sometimes wool batting, people hear wool and they automatically think that wool is going to be hot and heavy and that they're not going to be able to wash it. And in fact, it's the opposite. Wool breathes really, really nicely, and it's because of those layers. The air can kind of move through it, and it's nice and light, and it's really poofy. It has like a nice loft to it. I know machine quilters, our machine quilter anyway, loves the wool batting. It's definitely our top seller here at Alewives. It's what I use in almost all of my quilts versus the cotton. Cotton tends to have a different effect. It's kind of more thick and heavy, and it lays flatter, kind of like a effect like a blanket. So the wool is nice for this project because it has kind of like a cloud-like loft to it. So it's almost like a little mini duvet, and it breathes better. It just keeps you warmer in the winter but cooler in the summer. And you can wash it, and you can actually put it in the dryer on low heat or no heat, or you can just let it air dry. So it works really, really, really well. And if somebody lives in like a warmer climate, or they've used heavy fabrics, like the Velveteen is obviously a heavier fabric, or they've used flannel for their quilt, I always recommend that they use the wool. And it's kind of counterintuitive because you think wool is going to be hot and heavy. And in fact, it's not. It's light and airy and breathes really, really well. I did want to point out that for the most part, everything matches up really nicely. If there's places like right there where it doesn't match up perfectly, you know, by like a smidgen, there's my hand for reference, don't worry about that. Probably by the time that you stretch your fabric a little bit and put a pin in there, it's going to work itself out. However, having said that, over here we have a little bit more of a discrepancy, and if you have places where your fabrics don't match up and stretching and pinning is not going to help you out, then just go ahead and use your scissors. This is where it's going to be hard to do this one-handed, but you guys get the idea. Just use your scissors and trim those places. This is where this project being low-tech is a good thing. Like I said, you guys, you really can't screw this up. So use your scissors, trim those places off. You may have to do a little bit more trimming because you want everything to be exactly the same size, because the next thing that we're going to do is pin everything together and then pass it through our sewing machine to do all of the sewing. And basically, this is just doing your mise en place. You want everything nice and neat. And then the payoff is when you do all of your sewing, that when you've done your mise en place and you've made everything nice and neat and made sure that everything matches up, then your sewing is going to be very, very easy. So that'll be next. All right, ladies and gents, I have completed the pinning stage. And if you've ever taken a class with me, you've gotten my pinning lecture, which is basically me complaining about pinning and how I don't like to do pinning. I think besides cutting, pinning is my least favorite part of making a project. I like to put my pins in parallel to the edge of the fabric, and I also like to put them in approximately where the stitching is going to be. So in this case, our seam allowance is going to be a 1/2 inch. So I've just eyeballed a 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric, and then I've put the pin in parallel to the fabric, and I've woven the pin in twice. So you've got 2 points of articulation, I guess you would call it, where the stitching is going to be. I know some people would put their pins in, what would that be, perpendicular. But when you do that, you just have 1 point of articulation, and this just gives you a little bit more bang for your buck, if that makes any sense. The other thing that I like to think of is the direction that you'll be sewing in. So when I'm sitting at my sewing machine, I'm going to be sewing like this with the fabric coming down towards me. So if I've placed the pin like this with the point always facing away from you as you're sewing, you can pull the pin out towards you. And that's something that the lady who hired me, her name was Maya Hart, she hired me at the store when I was 19 years old. That's something that she taught me pretty much from day one,
is if the point of the pin is pointing away from you, you can always pull it out towards you as it's approaching underneath the presser foot. If it's headed the other way with the point facing towards you and the head of the pin underneath the presser foot, it's really, really hard to get it out when it gets close to the presser foot and it's stuck underneath the presser foot. So that's just one of those things that I learned kind of from day one. Now I'm sure you guys are probably wondering, why do I have these 2 pins here? Well, there's 2 pins here, and there's another 2 pins over here. And if I zoom out a little bit, can you guys see there's 2 pins over there and 2 pins over there? Those are just the pins that I'm leaving for an opening. I'm going to start sewing over here on this side and go do 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 do. Do you like my sound effects? Do 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 do, and then stop sewing right there. And then this is the opening that I'm leaving so that I can turn the throw right sides out. And those pins, the 2 pins that are perpendicular to the edge of the fabric, that's another thing I've always done. It's just a visual clue to my little brain that I need to stop sewing, that I would have an opening. So this is just a little visual clue. That's something I've always done to tell myself to do some back and forth stitching right here when I start, and do some back and forth stitching right here to stop sewing, and that this space needs to remain free and clear of any stitches so that I have a place to turn the throw. Here I am upstairs. I've started sewing. This is just a quickie. I actually told you guys I was going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I ended up improvising. I felt like a 1/2 inch wasn't enough. I ended up doing more like 5/8 of an inch. And also, when I was describing to you guys the motion of the sewing machine, I was saying that the fabric was going to be coming towards me, and of course that's not correct. The fabric is going away from you. But here is just a really good example you can see of what I was talking about with the pin, being able to pull that head of the pin out away from you so that it's not going underneath the presser foot. And of course, the other good thing about putting the pins in parallel to the edge of the fabric is that you're kind of forced to take them out so that you can't sew over them, because that's another thing that Maya Hart taught me pretty much as soon as she hired me from day one, is that you should never ever ever sew over your pins. She told me some horror stories. You can see here that the seam allowance swallows up any of those words and any of the weird bits of the selvage. I'm just going to finish up. I just thought of one more thing I wanted to share with you guys while I was up here sewing. See how I have a little pucker right there? Boop, boop, boop. There's actually quite a few places like that in the duvet as I was sewing, and it just occurred to me that that might happen to you guys too, and that especially if you're a beginner, that they could be even more exaggerated. This one's fairly small, but they might be even more exaggerated than that, and that sometimes it can be frustrating. You think you're doing something wrong. When you get puckers like that, it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you suck or that your life is a sham. It just means that, especially on a project like this, that you probably could have avoided that if you'd used more pins. If you have a walking foot, this would be a great project to use your walking foot on and just point out, you know, hey, I've been doing this a long time. I've got a series of little puckers like that, and some of them are bigger, and I quote unquote know what I'm doing. So if you guys have puckers like that too, even if they're bigger and even if there are quite a few of them, it is not going to matter. Also, if you have places where the batting, despite your best intentions, is poking out beyond the edge of the fabric, don't worry about that. You can trim it down later. It's not going to matter at all. So I know I sound like a broken record, but it's really, really hard to screw up this project. Okay, we're back downstairs, and I've sewn around all 4 corners of the duvet. And like I said, I ended up kind of improvising and using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and it is definitely not neat, and it is not perfectly uniform around all of the duvet, but it totally doesn't matter. And look at how messy that is. It doesn't matter, it's gonna be fine. I just wanna show you guys, I have lots of places where there are puckers, and I could have avoided those if I pinned more. 5/8 inch seam allowance I just felt like was a little bit better than the 1/2 inch seam allowance, mostly because of this stuff that was going on right here. If it was a 1/2 inch, it would have shown the holes in the selvage and the words on the selvage. So instead of bothering to trim it, I just made the seam allowance a little bit bigger. And I know some of you guys like, after you're all done, to neaten up your seam allowance or trim it down. You can if you want to. I actually would advise against it. The reason why is because I think that the bigger the seam allowance, the better. I've made a bunch of these duvet little throws over the years. I've used them a lot, I've washed them a lot, and the only thing, they've held up really nicely. The only thing is every once in a while a seam on them will pop open. So that's why I think it's probably not a good idea to trim down the seam allowance any smaller. I think that the bigger seam allowance, the better. My advice is to just leave it alone. It's going to be on the inside, nobody's going to see it, and in the long run, it will probably help promote the longevity of your throw. But I am going to just trim the corner off of, and I'm still going to leave about that much of the fabric of the velveteen, the voile, and the batting. But trimming that corner off a little bit will give us a little bit of a better corner when we go and we turn everything right side out on our duvet. So I'm going to do that on all 4 corners. Then I'm going to reach in here. This is that spot where I had the 2 pins that were perpendicular. I'm going to reach in here, and after I've trimmed all 4 corners, and turn everything right side out. So the next time that you see this, it will be turned right side out. All right, so I've completed the turning of the throw right side out, and I was excited because I've never worked with this velveteen before, and my instinct was that it would be a good fit, and I was right, and everybody likes to be right. It is a little stiffer than the Anna Maria Horner velveteen, but it's still drapey enough. I think ideally this velveteen would be used for upholstery, so it'd be great for a seat cushion or for pillows or for making a bag, but that in this case it does work really, really well for making the throw, especially with the voile on the other side. So the corners came out really nicely, especially after clipping them that little bit. So the last couple of steps, I just need to show you guys how to close up the opening. We're going to do that with what's called a ladder stitch. My mom calls it a teddy bear stitch because it's the stitch that they use to close the backs of stuffed animals. And the other thing that I'm going to show you guys how to do just really, really quickly is how to tie, because we're going to put ties in the throw with some embroidery floss. And why do we need to tie this with embroidery floss and put some stitches in there? Well, the reason is because if we left this just the way that it was without doing something to anchor all 3 layers together, the velveteen, the batting, and the voile backing, when you go to wash this, then all those layers would separate and kind of billow apart, and that wouldn't be good. It would definitely make it so that your throw wouldn't hold up as long as you want it to. And you can do something else. It doesn't have to be tying it with embroidery floss. I just like the look of those little tufts. They don't show up very much. I picked kind of like a cranberry colored floss because I thought that that looked really nice. It's gonna show up hardly at all from the back. I've taken a stitch right here, and then you can see from the back it hardly shows up at all. So you really just have to kind of think about the color from the front. In this case, I'm calling the velveteen side the front. And if you didn't want to tie, you could bar tack back and forth with your machine. You could take little tacks by hand with the same thread that you use to close up the stitch, to close up the opening with the ladder stitch. It's just totally up to you. But you do have to do something. to keep those 3 layers together. And all that we're gonna do, because I wanna preserve like that billowiness and that feeling of like a duvet, all that we're gonna do is 16 ties. So I kind of think of the patchwork, I'm calling it a patchwork throw, but the velveteen and voile throw, I think of it as, it's a square, and I think of it as a grid. So we're gonna go 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 ties across, 1, 2, 3, 4 ties down, so that we have a total of 16 ties. We're gonna start off by closing the opening with a ladder stitch. All right, so this was the spot where I had kept, can you see okay? This is the spot where I had those 2 pins that were perpendicular to the edge of the fabric, and it was just to let me know, hey, you need to stop right here and do some back and forthing, and I left an opening to turn the throw right sides out. So I do have 2 strands of thread. I think it's best to use 2 here. You want that little bit of extra strength. And I'm using an all-purpose poly. Again, I think sometimes poly gets a bad rap. I like to use all-purpose poly, Mettler. It's just what I've always used here, and it works really well. And it's really strong. And I've just taken a stitch and anchored the knot on the inside of the velveteen. And now I'm going to come across, and I don't even know what needle I'm using. I just was using whatever I could find. I think it's some sort of a sharp. So I've come across and I took a stitch that was probably about a 1/2 inch away. And I would say I am approximately 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. Now I'm gonna go back across again and take a stitch that's approximately 5/8 of an inch away from the edge of the velveteen, and maybe about a 1/4 inch away from the stitch I started with. And then pop up about a 1/4 of an inch away. Can you guys see that? And now I'm going back across, taking a stitch. And I've always assumed that they call this the ladder stitch because it makes, when you travel back and forth, it kind of looks like the rungs of a ladder. All right, and I'm going to do a few more. All right, I'll do one more. And then, all right, so can everybody see that? All right, now I'm going to pull it tight, and this is where you'll see what's so great about this. So I've got those rungs, they kind of look like rungs of a ladder, boop, 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 boop. But when I pull it tight, they virtually disappear. And you cannot see them. So that's what's so great about this stitch. And then I would just continue on down the line, taking a stitch, and then going across to the other fabric. Taking a stitch. Come on, needle. Taking a stitch and going across and taking another stitch. Taking a stitch. Okay, and then I'm gonna pull it tight one more time. And you'll see how it magically disappears. You cannot tell that that was sewn by hand and that the rest of this was sewn by machine. So that's how you close up your opening. And it's really important too that that opening be in the middle. My mom pointed this out to me. It's one of those times that she was right, that it shouldn't be on a corner. It has to be in the middle. If you're trying to start on the corner with a ladder stitch, it's really, really difficult. So make sure that you keep your opening in the middle. And I'll just show you guys how I do tying. Okay, so tying is one of those things, there's like a million bajillion different ways that you can do it. This is the way that I was taught. I have 6 strands of embroidery floss. You can separate it if you like a little thinner look. But in this case, I just kept all 6 strands of the embroidery floss. And I'm just kind of eyeballing in my mind where the 4 knots are going to go. 4 knots across and 4 knots down, so I have a total of 16 ties. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the second tie I'm going to make, I've already made one here, I just haven't tied it yet, is going to go right about here. So this is where it helps to have strong fingers and to be working on a table that you don't care too much if it gets scratched up. So I've taken a little stitch there, and now I'm pulling, pulling, pulling. Come on, there we go. And this is something that Maya taught me, and it works really well, is to not worry about snipping in between here yet. This saves you so much time, and ultimately it doesn't waste any thread. So now, my third tie, I'm gonna say is gonna go right about here. All right, and then my fourth, I'm gonna say, is gonna go right about here. I'm gonna push my luck and go for it. Okay, so I'm using a chenille needle. You can use an embroidery needle. If you do, you'll probably have to separate your strands because the embroidery needle isn't as thick as a chenille needle. So the eye of a chenille needle is a little bit bigger, but the point of a chenille needle is sharp. Okay, so this is where you start to do your ties. So you want to leave the ties long enough that you can make a square knot. And you could keep going depending on how long your string is. So I'm going to cut right about there. That gives me enough to work with. Now, right, a square knot you want to do a square knot. So a square knot you go under and pull, and then you go over and pull. And then you can leave the ties as long as you want. It's a very personal decision. See how you can pull this through and snip? And I go under and pull, and then I go over. Maybe. I still got it. Okay, over and pull. Your excess you pull through. And this is how you can have that kind of assembly line feeling of tying or of taking all of your stitches at once, but at the same time not wasting any thread because you're pulling through any excess as you go. So I'm going to do my square knot. Under and pull it tight. Over and pull it tight. And snip. And then down here we go to the last one. Under and pull it tight. Over and pull it tight. And then you still have all this thread to keep going. You've just done 4. You would do 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. You can do more if you want. I probably wouldn't do less. I think you need at least 16 to hold your duvet together. I'm back, and the duvet is all done. The patchwork velveteen voile throw, whatever you'd like to call it. And I think it came out really nicely. I'm kind of excited to share it with you guys because you'll remember I had a little places where I had some catches and gathers as I was sewing, and I told you guys at the beginning that this was really hard to screw up, and I hope that I've proved that to you. That all of those places where I had little gathers and little puckers, none of that matters in the end. Let me flip this over just so you can see the reverse side and how pretty it is. Here's a place, let's zoom in on a mistake I made. Here's a place where there was like a little pucker and a little gather. It just doesn't matter. So, like I said, I quote unquote know what I'm doing. I make mistakes. It just doesn't matter in the end. One last thought before I leave you is washing these. You just have to remember that you kind of have 3 different types of fabrics going on. You have the velveteen, of course, and then you have the voile. Common denominator that you're going to have to keep in mind when you wash is that you have a wool batting inside there. So with the wool battings, what we recommend is that you use the cold water setting to wash and that you dry on the low heat or the no heat setting. And I guess that's it. I can't think of anything else to share with you guys. So thank you for listening and for watching the video.